Hi everybody. So I'm Rosalyn. I'm here at UCL working on an edited collection of Latin American indigenous peoples' myths of climate change, and particularly addressing the question of whether or not they consider that we are facing the end of the world. And if so, what does that end of the world look like? Will the world begin again? Has the world ended before? These are the kinds of questions that we've been asking. So today I'll give excerpts from 3 contributors to the book, one of which is myself, in Central America, Mexico, in the Andes, which all explore those same questions from 3 different places. But firstly, a word about the validity of this kind of mythic narrative, as Chris was saying. I mean, often we sort of often think of climate change as being within the realm of science, and this is often the vehicle which we use to talk about climate change. But it's my belief that mythology can offer us a sort of a more rounded perspective on climate change, and one that perhaps makes it more relevant to our everyday lives. So I gave a presentation like this last year I was at the Glastonbury Festival last year, and I think it was Professor Sir David King, who is the government's special representative on climate change, who specialises in carbon cycles. He was speaking at Green Futures. So I went along to his talk and I asked him what was predicted to happen under climate change. Essentially, is the world about to end? I thought this was a wonderful opportunity to have somebody there who might actually know. And he said that they really don't know. He said that they couldn't really model what climate change would do. We're sort of stepping into the realm of the unknown and unprecedented with climate change, that the climate science that we have is good at mapping what has already happened. But in terms of projections, for example, the capacity of the oceans and plants to absorb excess carbon in the atmosphere, they knew that this would happen, but they didn't know to what extent that would happen, or on the effect that would have on environments, which I found really interesting. And it reminded me of a point made by a Brazilian anthropologist who some of us here are fond of, called Eduardo Viveiros de Castro, who says that, who argues that mythology is a superior vehicle for science, for talking about the end of the world. The end of the world sort of precludes the end of science, so it rather flummoxes it. But for mythologies, the end of the world is their speciality, as well as the beginnings of worlds. This is precisely the sort of subject matter that mythologies love. It's their bread and butter. So I thought maybe we'd start off a bit by continuing Chris's reflections on what might constitute science and what might constitute mythology, and how these two things are different. I mean, both are certainly stories that we tell ourselves about the nature of the world. But when we say these things here in the West, when science has the implication of a search for truth about it, and indeed science uses empirical methodologies to back itself up, and only ever asserts what it can prove and demonstrate. Whereas mythology has a far more sort of speculative air about it. Mythologies are replete with characters and emotions and narratives, and may view environments and non-humans as beings or sentient actors, which science has no evidence for, yet rejects. And I think one of the most sort of relevant differences between these two ways of looking at the world is based in this divide that we have over here in what we call the modern world, where we are now, if you like, between culture and nature. We've got this quite sort of fundamental divide between the two things, whereby culture is constituted of human beings and our creations, loosely, and nature is everything else. And science sort of emanates from this view of the world. Science would be firmly over there in the culture category. And what science does is it looks at nature. Nature is the raw material of science, as it is the raw material of culture. So this table, say, was once a tree, and then it was nature, but we've taken it and we've sort of cultured it a bit, and now it's a table. In the same way a sort of scientist might look down the microscope at something and sort of, I don't know, look at its molecules or whatever, that sort of thing that they do, or take a telescope and look out at the stars. And this operation of observation is expected to be one way. We don't expect what we're looking at through the microscope to be looking back at us. We don't expect it to be manipulating us, we manipulate it. Which is, of course, the genius of Douglas Adams's hypothesis in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, that the whole Earth was in fact an experiment run by laboratory white mice who were testing out various theories on human beings. He sort of reverses the relationship of agency that we take to be fundamentally constitutive of the world that we live in and very rarely question. I mean, even attempts to question and to criticize that are I sort of find it very difficult to get out of that mentality. So recently in bed I've been listening to Philip Pullman's marvelous trilogy called Northern Lights. I don't know if anybody else has read that. Yes, some nods. So, sorry?
Seen the movie.
Seen the movie. Okay. The audio books are better. Like it's superb. I'm really enjoying them. But he has this notion of a thing called dust. And dust is consciousness for him. It's sort of particles of pure consciousness that emanate from the act of sustained concentration. Children have them, but not in the same way as adults do, more weakly. And similarly, dust clusters around human creations. Which is, I mean, as well as armoured polar bears and mulefa, which are these elephant-like creatures that Philip Pullman has, who can make tools and thus have culture and so have consciousness. And this separates them from everything else in the world. Whereas I think in some of these mythic traditions that we're looking at, in the Andes or Puebla, everything would have consciousness or dust clustered around it, especially mountains, which are divine conscious entities capable of affecting and acting on humans and existing in relationships of fruitful exchange with them. And in Guatemala, which we will look at in our second example, the dust would be sort of scattered through the forest and perhaps particularly cluster around the hidden haunts of spirits. I think, of course, this perspective that Philip Pullman has is kind of a way to, he's in a way trying to escape from this Christian frame of the world, which separates human beings as the made in God's image and like God as creators, able to use and create with nature, and uniquely holding souls, whereas the nature, everything else, don't have souls, don't create. This is sort of falls within the dominion of man in a Christian perspective. So I believe that these two perspectives kind of underlie the world that we're looking at, and indeed sort of underlie how we're seeing climate change. But climate change presents a challenge to the separations of this worldview. It sort of creates a crisis in how we look at the world, because what's happening in climate change is that nature is acting upon us in uncontrollable ways, like flash floods or freezing weather fronts and so on. And we're beginning to acknowledge that these changes in nature are being caused by culture, which is, we're reasonably familiar with. We do stuff over here in culture and then nature responds, fine. But in order to prevent these changes happening, we have to change culture to adjust it around nature. So this means nature is forcing us to change, which creates a bit of a crisis in our worldview, because we do stuff to nature and nature doesn't do stuff to us. It seems we'd have to stop using so many natural resources, which were considered our dominion or our cultural raw material. So I think it's perhaps particularly fruitful with climate change to open the conversation with other cultural perspectives that maybe didn't start by looking at the world as separated into these two categories of nature and culture, and related human beings to their environments in quite different ways. Indeed, I believe that climate change is a unique opportunity for us to converse across these cultural lines, because it is something that's happening to us all worldwide at the same time. So it's a sort of unparalleled opportunity in a way for us all to talk to each other about what's going on and how we might deal with it. Thank you. Also we're aware that other cultures seem to be living in the world without creating to climate change, whereas no matter what we try to do, we seem to be contributing to it, and that's quite difficult to get away from. So how are other peoples doing this, and how does their worldview assist them in doing this? Can other cultures show us new worlds, new ways of conceiving the cosmos? And in anthropology, we've been having a lot of these conversations recently, and we call this cosmopolitics. It's a term coined, I believe, by Isabel Stengers, if anybody wants to read about it more. Just before I launch into my mythology, is there any water in the room? Because I can see I'm going to get thirsty or something. Thank you, Chris.
I'll have to go outside and get it.
Oh,
Taps bottled water.
That's very kind, thanks. So the first example I'll be talking about today is from the Kekchi Maya people of Central America. Their lands distributed across southern Guatemala and northern Belize. And I'm taking this material from a wonderful ethnographer called Stefan Permanto, who's a contributor to the volume that I'm working on. He's got some really, really lovely material, which I'm going to sort of try to summarize a bit of for you. As he points out, there was this famous end of the world prophecy in 2012, which was mainly held by non-Maya people, though based apparently on Maya religious stelae from this sort of classical pre-Hispanic Maya period. And of course, this predicted end of the world in 2012 spectacularly failed to materialize itself, despite many people having made preparations for it to have happened. Thank you so much. But despite this, Stefan says, real Maya people do in fact talk about the end of the world quite a lot, and consider that it's something that might be coming, that might be imminent. So firstly, I'll sort of introduce you to how they look at the world. They refer to this living earth as Sultaka, which I hope is the right pronunciation, which means mountain, hill, valley, which also means the one and the many. So whilst manifesting as one singular being, the living earth or Mother Earth, the Sultaka manifests simultaneously as many individual beings, here referred to as Sultakas, linked to specific hills, mountains, and caves. And the Sultakas live in stone houses or caves inside these hills and mountains, which are described as being fabulous palaces inside. Every mountain or hill that has a cave in it is linked to a particular resident Sultaka who is the owner of this hill and its adjacent valleys, which turns the whole landscape into a mosaic of properties owned and controlled by different Sultakas, which I guess this landscape looks a little like this. So the Sultakas are considered masters of everything that exists upon and within the earth, which includes everything from the food people eat, the corn, beans, and the resources of the jungle, the bushes, trees, to bodies of water, to animals, and to some extent human beings. Kekchi elders say they have a strong attachment to the ancient Mother Earth Sultaka and that she raises them as her children. They are dependent on her for their survival and sustenance. And this Sultaka indeed acts as a protective mother, nurturing and caring for her children whilst demanding that people are respectful not only to the Sultakas but to other human beings and non-humans. So these Sultaka spirits are responsible for the weather and as such bear much in common with the ancient Maya gods, the Chaks. So lightning and thunder are the spirits hurling their axes through the air. And what we would understand to be comets or shooting stars are, according to the Kekchi, correos or messages, even emails, that the Sultaka are sending to one another across the hills. In order for us to be able to use the resources then on which we depend, to be able to perform agriculture, to hunt animals in the forests and so on, these resources all belong to the Sultaka, so they demand that humans lead a morally correct existence, respecting all life, and conduct the proper feeding rituals to the Sultakas, giving them animal blood, incense, cacao, and flowers. And also that we ask for things that we wish for, such as bountiful harvests, or not to let the animals eat our crops, or for favourable weather conditions, that we ask the Sultaka for these conditions. So humans and Sultakas are inherently dependent on one another for nourishment and sustainment or life. We feed the Sultaka in rituals, and they feed us the things that we need in return. Indeed, Maya creation myths claim that the Sultaka created humans in order that we could worship and feed them. So the spirits in this worldview existed prior to us and created us in order that we could fulfill this role, which Pamanto summarizes in terms of existential reciprocity between humans and Sultakas. So according to contemporary Kekchi people, if they failed to lead a morally correct life, ask for permission to use the Sultaka's resources, or properly conduct the required feeding rituals prior to hunting or cutting down trees, they failed to observe the reciprocal bond that was set up at the beginning of creation. And this will result in devastating consequences and wreak havoc upon the world. Such behavior will unleash the rage of the Sultakas, who may snatch away the spirit of the transgressor and withhold animals and corn seeds within their caves, so that they are not accessible for people, and send wild animals to eat the crops of the transgressors. And indeed, currently many people are diverting their attention away from these ancient traditions or costumbre. They say that young people in particular are following instead the modern traditions of other foreign cultures, which is a phenomenon dispersed amongst all the three groups of people that we will look at today. Reasons in particular given as to why people now fail to lead these morally and ritually correct lives relate to centuries of displacement, and I think particularly the Guatemalan Civil War of the sort of late 20th century, which resulted in huge displacement of peoples, as well as contemporary poverty. The things that people have to buy to conduct the rituals, the cacao and so on, are expensive, whereas I imagine that in the past these were things that people produced themselves. As well as religious fragmentation, particularly the arrival of Protestant evangelical religions, and what he calls other aspects of modernity, which is something I'll look into in a bit more detail. So as a result of these changes in human attention towards rituals and respect, the weather is growing increasingly unpredictable, creating issues for the growing seasons. Deforestation is destroying Sultaka shrines and houses, leading to devastating consequences, disempowering or killing the spirits that inhabit these zones or forcing them into displacement. If people stop worshipping the Sultaka altogether, this would lead to the end of the world. The harvest will yield nothing, animals will die and people will starve. And indeed, this is a process which Elders hypothesize is in the process of happening as people increasingly leave these rituals behind, and they believe that as the old people die off, there'll be nobody left to conduct the rituals at all. However, they do hope that people might realize this and start conducting the proper rituals again. Indeed, there have been several attempts to do this by elders in southern Belize, sort of uniting all the communities of an area and attempting to conduct the proper respect rituals to the jungle spirits. So as we can see from this first account, human life depends on a world of spirits which are prior to and indeed have created our world and must be allocated the proper respect in order to maintain it. This respect consists in rituals and communication with them through shamanic practices and good human behavior. This indeed is a common feature of all the mythic narratives that we've collected for the volume, which I think is fascinating. The idea that this world that we have is in fact a sort of product of another sort of spiritual one which is prior to it and which upon which it depends for its continued existence. And of course this narrative of Stefan's also introduces the idea of spiritual activism, of avoiding the end of the world by renewing spiritual practice and spirit worship and respect thereby for the sorts of resources that we use, which we can now continue to explore through looking at the Masewal people in Puebla, Mexico, as explored by Alessandro Cuesta Robelado, another contributor to the volume. And there's a lovely picture of his fieldwork area there. So the Masewal inhabit a world that is already broken. Mountains are the broken pillars which once connected the earth and sky in a unified cosmos. And at the end of a previous age, in another environmental cataclysm that also introduced death to the world, these mountains were broken, along with the primal unity and connection between worlds. This then is a world already broken, which feebly clings to existence. Alessandro's idea is that this idea of the world having ended in the past is in fact a remembrance of the Spanish conquest of the Americas, when huge proportions of people then died as a result of disease and war and so on. And it came close to a sort of a complete cultural decimation and a time of great change and upheaval. But interestingly, this perhaps gives us the idea of the possibility of continuity through cataclysm, of how worlds, even though almost completely broken, might somehow survive. So I think interestingly about all these narratives, whilst there are continuities between them, are the fact that they're all very particular to the environments in which they are produced. So the Masewal chiefly worship the mountains that they inhabit, as do the people I work with in Bolivia. And as Alessandro points out, the importance of mountains, if you live on one, is straightforward. The mountain attracts the weather, and the springs which give you water spring from the mountain. You use its soils to grow your crops. So it's straightforward that these are sort of ultimate deities if you live in a mountainous region. Also the land's true owners and hosts, I'm not going to attempt to pronounce either of those words, are the ancestral non-human beings that animate the land and are the force behind most of its continuities and transformations. The fact that humans are just caretakers of the land and not its owners keep Masewal people aware of a certain anxiety by recognizing that there are pre-existing rules and secret relations that precede them. So among the Masewal, as in Guatemala, the continuity of life is associated with remembering these spirits which are inherent in the land and in all the resources that we want to use. So this town here where Alessandro did his fieldwork is called Tepecintla, which means mountain low place. Pious translations, he says, offered by a few of the town's young activists advocate for this meaning mountain of corn cobs. Yet another translation published by diviners and some elders is a place of many hills. The secret name is, however, Mountain Seat, aka Mountain's Arse, and is not, of course, the preferred local translation, although it is grudgingly accepted as the real one. So mountains here are complex living entities with bodies composed of many living forms, complete with arses, heads, and indeed hearts. Every mountain has a core or heart of some precious metal, either gold or silver. Mining corporations are thought to know this for a fact, and this is precisely what they are after. The heart is what sustains life of all sorts, and without it a mountain is poor. There is no word for poverty in Nahuatl, so they use the Spanish word pobre. Poverty is locally understood not as a lack of money, but as an absence of life. Hence, a poor mountain produces no maize and no animals, no clouds come to nest on its crests, and no rivers spring from its base. The sustainer spirits will abandon a poor or heartless mountain, just as the water beings will forsake its depths. The mountain will then become a yellow and rotten place. And again, this is a society which is undergoing a lot of contemporary change. Decades of intensive rural-urban migration. Most of the people currently in the village have spent a good deal of their working lives as labourers in Mexico City, an enormous contemporary metropolis. And this, combined with the advent of mining in the region and the abandonment of traditional agricultural cultivation, are all locally perceived as linked processes that have effectively destroyed the land. These processes are also major spiritual grievances caused ultimately by collective forgetfulness, leading potentially to the end of the world. A forgetfulness of the spirits again and of the respect rituals that sustain our existence. As in Guatemala, the Masewal are attempting to rekindle their relations with said spirits, recovering old practices, words, and celebrations. They are also instrumentally repurposing these cosmological arguments and characters to enforce a new discourse of no confidence in the so-called megaproyectos, or large-scale development projects like mines and roads, being carried out in the region and are making demands for the companies carrying them out for compensation. So to this end, they've formed a variety of local organisations which hold that the promises of wealth, development and progress made by the engineers, government officials and corporations' PR teams are systematically rejected on the grounds of the insuperable argument that what this myriad of investors ultimately want are their land and water. According to Luis Macias, a local Macewal activist and renowned diviner, these promises are all just tales or fake news that need to be disputed with available local knowledge or real stories. Fight fire with fire, as the saying goes, Alessandro comments. So we're sort of using spiritual activism as a tool to counteract some of the damaging effects of a predatory, resource-hungry capitalism here, which fascinates me about this work. So what the Macewal are actually doing is bringing saints to mountain shrines and placing wooden crosses upon them and calling out to the angels and protector spirits of the place, offering them food and music in return for forgiveness and sustenance. There is a notoriously effervescent revitalization of traditional dances that mimic numerous spirits and make visible ideal relations of reciprocity between the land and its people. And young people are increasingly interested in talking about ritual protocols and interpretations of spirits' real identities and purposes, which is fascinating, I think, in this community, very much halfway between Puebla and Mexico City, that it should recuperate its history in this way, as a sort of direct conversation with modernity. So they put forth that mining projects are not merely environmentally damaging projects, but aggressive foreign initiatives that can effectively kill a mountain. And local people are convinced that such an eventuality would end up killing them as well, or making them leave the mountain. Mining is hence understood as an act of war. Perhaps this is why mountains defend themselves and defend Macewal people too. Mountains here indeed can trap foreign people inside, release predators, or send floodwaters cascading down their slopes. And the heart of the mountain has immense riches inside, besides precious minerals. Everything you can ever want is already there. But if you take too much, you kill the mountain, and it kills you in turn somehow. So hold on to this idea of there being a sort of balance of reciprocity. It's another sort of feature common to my work. And indeed here there was a famous incident in which some gringos from a mining company got stuck inside a cave in a mountain when it partly collapsed, and the whole region found out about this, and then for them it evinced this idea that the mountains could take revenge on people. But can mountains take revenge on people? Interesting proposition. So once again in this narrative, the world is really owned by spirit presences which we must respect in order to survive. We're connected to these spirits through reciprocity. The mountains are the source of all riches, and we'll surrender them in reasonable amounts where we worship and ask for them correctly. Whereas if these reciprocal relations are not observed, people are wiped out in cataclysm. Indeed, I think these myths and stories offer excellent explanations for the contemporary climate change that we're going through. I mean, what if we were to view forests and land as imbued with spirits who are their rightful owners and will share and provide with us as long as we don't ask for too much, or cut out the heart of the mountain, or cut down all the trees until there's no forest left? Indeed, I think these myths are key to carrying out sustainable cultural practices. Now, with what remains, I'll move on to my own fieldwork, which is among a set of people who sometimes call themselves the Kalawaya, in a region, beautiful region of Bolivia, right in the center of Latin America, called Apolobamba. And that there is the view from the upper community over the fields over there, and this mountain over here, Apu Akamani, is the supreme deity of the region. He's a sort of powerful mountain spirit. And the reason why I chose to go to this community was that 40 years ago, an anthropologist called Joseph Bastian wrote a beautiful ethnography called Mountain of the Condor, and put forth that the people of Kata perceive the mountain they inhabit to be a living body, and Kata lies at the stomach or center of this mountain body with its terraced fields which cultivate potatoes, which are key to the sustenance of the villages at all the different levels of the mountain. Down at the legs of the mountain, you've got villages that produce cocoa, which people chew, same stuff as you make cocaine out of. Up at the top of the mountain, you've got mountain lakes, which are the mountain's eyes, and villages of herders who live at the head, and these guys are the ritual specialists. Indeed, the region's quite famous for its diviners. Back in the day, Kalawaya people would walk from village to village up and down the Andes, bringing these little bags of medicinal herbs that they were specialized in using. And the people of my village were quite sort of knowledgeable in plant lore, but they were really specialized as diviners. And indeed, they're quite famous within Andean countries for this capacity for divination. Famously, I think in the 1920s, a Peruvian president sent his daughter to be cured by Kalawaya healers when the doctors had given up on her, and of course she was cured. The way in which they cure is you go to them and they throw coca leaves, or they cut open the body of a guinea pig and read the spots on its liver, or read the patterns of distribution of the coca leaves, and so locate an illness or misfortune at a certain place in your body. And then to cure you, they go to the mountain body and cure the pertaining place on the mountain body by, so if there's something bad you need to get rid of, we could burn horrible things and let them be washed out by the river, and so taken out of the mountain body. So this is I think a landscape of reflection across scales. I like to think of it as being fractal. Indeed, this is a sort of another way of connecting ourselves to our environment rather than separating it into us, culture, and all that stuff out there. Nature, everything is sort of simultaneously reflecting itself. So here we get quite a good view of the mountain here. We can see the sort of the rich terraces which Kata uses to produce its potatoes and other crops. Some of them are empty over there, and the sort of further away ones which look a bit bare. They have a quite long 7-year fallow period. They sort of refuse to use chemical pesticides and fertilizers and keep this kind of very sophisticated system, in fact, of production going. So up there at the top of the mountains where it's colder, they produce potatoes. In the middle, they produce wheat, barley, beans, and peas in rotation. And then down at the bottom where it's warmer by the river, these are quite big mountain slopes, they produce maize. The system by which these crops are produced is regarded as being a form of exchange with the mountain, whereby you feed the mountain your love and your labor, and it feeds you back the food which you need. And of course, to carry out traditional agriculture like this, I mean, you can't get a machine in on these fields. They're sort of very steep terraces. So people rely on one another and exchange relationships with other people in order to be able to farm. So if I go and work in someone's field for a day, they not only will they give me beer and cocoa and food all day, they then owe me a day of labor, and they come and work for me in my field, and I give them food and beer all day. It's all very jolly. And like this, you can amass large work parties and carry out the harvest and that sort of thing. So you have these aini, they're called, relationships of exchange, linking together human beings. And another form of aini is manyai, which are the exchange relationships that link us to the landscape deities, such as the mountains. So to ask the mountains to be able to produce, there are many sort of big events in the ritual calendar where we'll go and offer the things to the land and play lots of music for it and ask it to give us the things that we need. So these aini and manai relationships constitute the balance of a healthy landscape, consisting of people, animals, plants, gods, and ancestors all bundled in together in a sort of in a Heideggerian sort of dwelling perspective. That's the view from my window in Qatar. It's a little bit dark there, isn't it? Let me see if I can turn the brightness up on this. Is that not any good? Not really. You can just about see it anyway. There's this is the main square of the upper village of Qatar, which is the older part of the village. It looks a bit abandoned, but there's actually a little old lady lives in that house there. There's the church to the right, and the house which I would be in if I'd just taken that picture. There's a family of us living there as well. Now this square was the heart of the mountain body, and underneath it were buried ancestors, powerful ancestors, which I was told dominated everything before from their position under the mountain. So you can see it looks a bit abandoned up there now. These are some of the houses just behind that main square where people used to live until there was a fire and the houses became abandoned. Most people have now moved down into the more modern lower part of Qatar, which you can see there with some truly horrible red-roofed houses, which were a government initiative to provide people with housing, which of course they were perfectly capable of building themselves, and in these times of high migration there was an abundance of empty houses, so it seemed to me rather a pointless project from a sort of development point of view, but yeah, it was mainly aesthetic, I believe. Down there in the main village, people have there's that sort of smaller square over there is a school, a secondary school, and running water, and there's a road going through. So that's where most stuff happens these days. But people do still come up to the old square in order to be able to carry out the rituals which the sort of village's yearly calendar kind of revolves around. This is one of the first fiestas that I was present there for, which I think is the Feast of the Ascension on the 24th of June, or apparently it's the Feast of the Ascension. So this is a sort of typical old-fashioned fiesta, which is really carried out for the benefit of the community and for the benefit of the land. Everybody gets together and plays music and drinks all day, and this for about 5 days, in fact. And this sort of collective dynamic produced is thought to be very fertile and to feed into the community and the landscape in a regenerative sort of way. I was really pleased to find all these photographs. I've put loads of them in, but the views are of course just stunning. There's our sort of virgin figure there. Of course, she's dressed like a Kalawaya with her little poncho on too. So we're just sort of blessing the main square there. And however, people lamented greatly that these traditional fiestas no longer had as many adherents as they once used to. They were often said to be very small. Most of the young people in the village now live away, either in the cocoa growing fields in the lowlands where they get paid a good money, in fact, to pick coca, or in La Paz if they can find wage labour in the city. So the fiestas are dwindling in size. Indeed, I was sometimes told by the older people that there were just a few of us left up here now to maintain the traditions. There's an increasingly kind of nationalistic air. And in fact, the sorts of fiestas that are popular these days and that sometimes the young people do come back for are the fiestas which are in the national calendar. These people were actually a bussed-in set of dancers brought in to kind of swell the numbers of people attending the fiesta in the village by my friend Emilio, which is a bit sad, but shows that people are still trying as much as they can to kind of keep these festival atmospheres coming. And indeed, at this fiesta, which is carried out in August, this is the bottom floor of the house I was living into, which on this occasion became a pub, which was marvellous, apart from the 24-hour sound system and the fact I was billed for all the electricity. But it was selling beer throughout the fiesta, which, of course, in a sort of traditional fiesta would be unheard of. The traditional fiestas are very much about sharing with each other, whereas this was one at which things could be bought and sold. And indeed, this chap here is not from Qatar. He married a girl from Qatar in La Paz, and he came to visit for the weekend, and they gave him a poncho and was very pleased about it. So, yeah, there we all are drinking some beer. I got rid of the really drunken ones. This is kind of still earlier on in the day. But yeah, back to the square anyway. So these ancestors used to be buried underneath it, who were sort of powerful ancestors from before times. But several years ago, they were dug up, apparently by archaeologists from Cuzco, and sold to them. And the reason I found out about this was because I was asking people, so are you still able to carry out the old weather rituals that you used to carry out, you know, to bring the seasons or to sort of make the sun come out or whatever? And they said, well, yes, we largely do, but the ritual to stop an excess of rain when it's really raining too hard, which coincidentally is one of the major issues under climate change. The rains come late and then they come all at the same time. They said we can no longer carry out this ritual because the mummies of the ancestors were really key to it, and a few years ago people sold them, so we can't do it anymore. And I thought how fascinating, really, that these two worlds should still have meaning at the same time. That these are the ancestors who were buried at the heart of the mountain, who ran the whole thing before, que dominaron todo antes, and they still had this ritual power about them. Yet at the same time, there was this other world of meaning, which perhaps was overlapping or overlaying that world, in which they were a resource which could be sold, one in which money had become more important than the heart of the mountain. So I see the community as being very much at this moment of shift and debate between these two world perspectives, which is more real. And indeed, they seem to they seem to sort of contest one another for meaning-making power. And this is it's another photograph I found over the weekend. I was very pleased. So these are my good friends Clotilde and Alejo. Alejo is one of my favorite people in Kata. He's very funny, he's very quick. And he's quite a controversial figure in the community. He's a sort of bright young man who's interested in being part of this new modern world of opportunity and experience, which I can well imagine that if I were from this village of 100 families in the middle of nowhere, I would be quite curious to use the internet and to go and live in the city and stuff as well. I can sort of see where he's coming from. I'm just doing the same thing in the other direction. So he had a mine below Kata, which was taking away what would have been the sacred flesh of the mountain in a way that would have been completely inconceivable a generation before. And it's a one-man operation. He went in with a JCB, scooped bits of mountain out, put it in a truck, drove it to Oruro and sold it for the minerals which it contained, which is good for computer parts, probably for exactly this kind of thing. And the village said, we're okay with this in this sort of new reality that we're all living, but they specified that he would have to, in return, buy all the booze for the community fiestas, which is one of the key things that they want money for. Be able to provide everything else themselves. However, tragically, during one of these fiestas, during a mission to go down and buy more booze during a fiesta, Alejo drove his four-wheel drive off this road here, which connects Kata down to the main town. As you can see, it's a pretty good big drop if you miss one of those corners on this sort of tiny, narrow, one-track dirt road. And 5 young men from the community who were traveling with him were all killed outright. And Alejo survived, probably due to the driver's airbag, which stopped the shock. But of course, he was very shell-shocked and very taken aback by the whole experience and tremendously guilty and so on. And when the community were trying to digest this experience, it's a small village of 100 families, and there are a few young men, and suddenly there are 5 of them all dead at the same time. There was on the Day of the Dead, which is when we sort of remember everybody who's died in that year. Everybody was down in the cemetery, and there were these tables full of offerings put on the graves, full of food and flowers and so on. And I went down, and some of the older men said to me, this is not our culture. They kind of get the hang of what I'm trying to do. This is not our culture. That Alejo, he's an addict. I was like, why are they calling him an addict? What do they mean by an addict? And eventually I worked out that what they mean is that an addict is someone who takes too much from the social whole for themselves, rather than circulating goods and feeding everybody else. He was sort of taking too much, and not just from other people, but from, I think, the mountain itself. So within the community's eyes, the crash had happened because Alejo had taken too much from the mountain with its mine, and so the mountain in revenge had exacted its blood price in taking the lives of these 5 young men. So again, we see these two worlds kind of come into conversation, one in which the mountain is just as we would say, a natural resource that is there for humans' culture to be able to extract what we want from, and this other world in which it's a living, animate being, and you can't screw with it because it's gonna do the same back. There it is, there, the mountain. It's kind of interesting to look at mountains like that and wonder, I mean, is this a deity? Can it think? Can it carry out revenge? Can it act upon us. I remember when I first got to Qatar, I was, I just couldn't conceive that could be true at all. And then after a sort of a few months there, every time I was about to go on a journey like everyone else, I was offering coca leaves to the mountain and putting them out, because the roads are so dangerous and journeys are so treacherous that you become convinced. I'll just can I play this? Yeah, this is a really lamentable camera skills here. I do apologise to everybody, but I'm just sort of trying to film the waste in the old river at Qatar. And what I'm trying to do again is to consider what the utility of this animist perspective might be for our, you got a glimpse of it there anyway, for how we look at climate change and you can't see it. Anyway, they have a river where they put, where all the sort of plastic rubbish is put. And when I originally went to the community and I said, are you interested in participating in a project about climate change? They said, oh yes, we're very interested in climate change. The contamination, it's here as well. And I thought, what do they mean? You know, they just pick up a shard of plastic from the floor and show it to me in this village where most people are still subsistence farmers, which kind of looks as far as possible like our sort of ideal sustainable dream. You know, they considered that this was contamination that was there as well. And so there was this extraordinarily responsible perspective whereby so every shard of waste that was produced was seen as being very much part of that environment. I mean, no bin man comes and takes it away and hides it from you. It's just there, you know. And in fact, sort of consumer food waste was the first useless thing that there had been in the community. Formerly, any kind of waste product was useful for something. So animal poo, you put it on the fields, great. Plant waste, you give it to the animals, brilliant. And everything was sort of cycling round in a system where everything was useful and everything had an eventual destination. So consumer waste, completely useless. At first, people were putting it on the fields, thinking it was fertilizer, and then these government workshops came and told them that actually this stuff was contaminating the land, and everybody panicked and tried to dig it up. Particularly batteries, which power the stereos that young people use. Every battery contaminates 10 square meters of land, I was told, with alarm. So across this change, the idea of the fractal landscape remains. So it's thought that as we eat consumer foods or sort of industrially produced foods, our bodies become weaker as the waste from these foodstuffs is weakening the mountain body. Worse than that as well, the industrially produced food can't provide us with any nourishment. Only food containing hard work, indeed Aini, exchange relationships between people and the land, was actually thought to be nourishing. Sort of the nourishment that we derive from food is a fruit of these healthy exchange relationships between humans and earth beings. Which is interesting because indeed from a modern perspective, we would agree with that, you know, that the industrially produced foods are less nourishing than stuff that people have grown themselves in the fields. We come to the same conclusion, but through the prism of two different worlds. And I find these sort of coincidences between these two different worlding practices really fascinating, in fact. Andeans would say that they coincide. So it's another sort of thing that we might take from this perspective for our own world is that fertilizers and pesticides were considered contaminants here, and their use was a greedy attempt to take too much from the land. EU technicians had introduced chemical fertilizers and pesticides around a decade ago, but they were treated with great suspicion. The villagers experimented with them on small plots, concluding that for a couple of years they make things grow well, but then nothing would grow at all. Some insects are good. And this was explained to me through the frame of an animist perspective. The earth has little holes in it, a man was telling me. These are real pores. You know, it can't breathe at all when we spray it because these little holes close up, you know. So these are people who've been to a sort of the secondary school in the village, and they've been taught that these kind of traditional beliefs aren't real and aren't true. And then he can triumphantly bring out, we can show, look, it really is. It needs these pores to breathe, and if it can't breathe, stuff won't grow. So we sort of, which also in a modern perspective, in a scientific perspective, we would agree with. Yet we carry on using the chemical fertilizers and pesticides anyway. I'm not really sure why. But interestingly here, the sort of the animist view of the mountain as a living body kind of makes more sense as a framework to explain to people what's going on. And indeed, when you think about it, a lot of the time gardeners do sort of speak about plants as if they had sentience and could think and move, or sort of refer to them analogically like human bodies indeed. And that we're sort of really catching on to these things now in the modern world. Of course, there's a UN FAO report dated 2012 called Wake Up Now, championing the virtues of small-scale organic agriculture in terms of keeping crops healthy. And also in a sort of climate change context, a greater diversity of crops, which, these guys have loads of varieties of everything they grow, as well as sort of non-organic crops growing in an environment, a sort of healthy hedgerows environment. This gives an environment a much greater adaptive capacity. The more different types of organisms that you have in an environment, the greater its resilience under climate change. So this is a useful, indeed vital strategy that we might do well to learn from. So in conclusion, so the perspective of the village here, and indeed of the Mexicans and Guatemalans of this village, the animate mountain of Aini exchange relationships, of the refusal to exceed the carrying capacity of the land, are perhaps vital strategies for healthy living. In a context of climate change, this system is highly adaptable. Crops are said to be moving up the mountain in Qatar as temperatures increase, but the crops are animate. People are merely following them up the mountain to conduct agriculture on them. This isn't an environment that people try to control. This is a living and alive and an animate environment which is subject to change. Which, if you're in an animate world and the mountains are God, it can do pretty much anything it likes. You don't expect to be able to predict what's going to happen to it day in, day out. You go with it and see what you can do. Whereas within the sort of naturalist or modern or Christian perspective, the idea that nature is something that we can control and predict is perhaps something that's going to cause us more problems in a changing world, and particularly in one where our agriculture is laid out with in sort of monoculture. If there's a slight shift in climate or growing conditions, we lose vast swaths of it. We don't distribute the risk through different varieties and different crops. Indeed, I think this is interesting as well, because we sort of often think of these sort of poor and marginalised and indigenous peoples as being the first victims of climate change, and maybe they will be, I don't know. But it looks to me as though there's a lot about their strategies for living that we could in fact learn from, and I wonder, in a situation of extreme climate change, who will fare the worst. And I really think that, there's this lovely quote from Bruno Latour that climate change is the revenge of Gaia on our sort of modernist culture-nature divide, which silences the natural world, which we might add would also take excessively and inconsiderately from it as a result of considering it unconscious raw material. Climate change is the sort of the comeback of nature, if you like, the kick in the arse for the naturalist who thought that the world was mute material that he could control. And hopefully what all of these worlds, I believe, put forward for us is the sort of utility of a fractal perspective that sees the environment and the self as reflecting each other across scale and being indivisible, rather than this wall-like modern divide between us, ourselves, and culture, and nature as everything else. Rather than locating climate change, sort of over there in nature, it was for the people in Qatar very much a part of our bodies and of our way of walking through the world, and indeed of everything that we do.